I'm kind of curious to know, like, how did you guys do it? I mean, I know some of you all out there got houses. I feel like it would be kind of interesting to hear how you did it. Tell me a little story about anything like that, buying a house.
What's going on, Jake? Jake's audience. If you're not new to the channel, you know how it is. So, Jake Mercure put out a video yesterday titled, Will Young People Ever Own a Home? And nowadays, in today's economy, I agree. It's pretty wild. It's actually crazy. And what I want to do in this video is I was one of these young people around, now it sounds crazy, like 5+ years ago, where I bought my first home. And I want to walk through kind of what the context is, kind of the unfair advantages I may have had, and as well as just the financials of how that looked like. And also, just after getting my home, I eventually refinanced as well. So I want to give that extra context as well, and just put it out there for anyone that is kind of looking to understand, how does this work, or just in general, like how I did it. I'll show us step by step. I'll also show kind of towards the end, kind of pitfalls and things I wish I knew and how I would have done it better. So with that, let's get straight into it. So I bought this home in early 2018, like the one that I'm recording in right now, and it was first built, for context, in a community with an HOA in 2004. But in 2004, what happened was that they were able to build out of like 100 plus townhomes in this subdivision per se. They were able to build half of it. And in 2008's recession happened. They didn't have credit slash just funding. And so they needed to put everything to a halt. And eventually they figured out whatever they needed to figure out. And so this property that I'm sitting in was built in 2014 specifically. In 2014, the first homeowners, they bought this property for $260,000. Now, this matters because I basically, now in 2018, after kind of saying, like, okay, hey, there's some damage here, there's some damage there, can I get some credits basically to, offset what I would need to, actually put in money wise, time wise, effort to literally take care of maybe some cracks in the garage. When you park, like maybe there's some cracks in the foundation, but those cracks, little small ones can become big ones over time. So kind of just sealing them up and doing what's needed. So net, I asked for like $6,000 in credits. And so essentially, this is the price of $300,000, basically was that, selling price, simply put. Of this $300,000, I basically put 10% down in terms of a down payment. And so 10% of 300,000 is basically $30,000. $30,000, whether it's a lot or not of money, is going to depend on the individual. But nowadays, just getting any down payment in general, 30,000 is 10% of 300K. It's not 20%, which would be $60,000, which is like a typical down payment. And the main difference that I learned, I was like, all right, well, it's not 20, so how am I able to do this? The reasoning was that if you have less than 20, generally there's something known as PMI, private mortgage insurance is my understanding of it. Basically, it's saying, hey, buddy, you don't have that much equity in this property. In other words, you don't have that much skin in the game. So what is the guarantee that you're actually going to see this loan through? And so in my situation, it was a 30-year mortgage, and I'll get into the numbers right here in a second. The point is, this extra line item is still a cost, and it's generally around 1% of the property value. So 1% of 300K is 3,000, divided by 12 is an extra like $250 a month. But it's like the choice of, do you want to get into the deal or not? The further context here was that the place where we were living at, that $500 a month for 2 bed, 2 bath, amazing again, that was basically needed to be like demolished because there's a concept known as eminent domain. And in our situation, what it was basically a religious organization wanted to expand, like just the whole road wanted to be theirs. And so they needed to take away 10 to 20 homes, which one of them was where your boy and others were living at. And so when they did that, it was basically like, okay, you have to leave. And so the choice, kind of the conundrum or the dilemma was, well, do we rent or do we buy? And so immediately it was like, all right, might as well buy if everything makes sense. So going through like this pre-approval process, dealing with a mortgage broker saying, hey, how much can I qualify for? Which at the time, what I didn't know was, okay, hey, they'll basically give you as much as they want or as much as you qualify for because it's like they get a commission off the amount that's loaned to you. So those numbers can be a little jacked up. So whether or not you can afford it or not is a totally different video and discussion, but more about running numbers and making sure, can you actually afford what is being lent to you on a monthly basis. So coming back to the numbers, this 30K over here was basically the down payment. And so now this 10% down payment meant that, there's all these other line items, but in the end, what is that? That's a 270,000 loan, essentially, like, just simple numbers. And this was at to my memory, it was either 4.385 or 4.375%. And it's one or the other, but the point is that this is where, it started. And it was basically like, all right, early 2018, we're in the deal. And then fast forward was when during COVID was when I refinanced. Right before that part, just for context of how much was going out each and every month, basically there's a concept known as PITI, P-I-T-I. So it's like principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And so that total amount, taxes, in other words, like property taxes, which one of the obvious things which I just didn't know at the time was even if you buy your home in full, you still have to pay taxes on an ongoing basis. And so, as simple as it sounds, the problem being that, in different states, level of property tax later on, it could be a lot. So, for example, if it's like 1% of 300K, that's $3,000 a year. But now in like Texas, for example, let's say the property tax is 4%. 4% of the same 300K is $12,000 a year. So even if you own your place in full, you still have to pay $1,000 in taxes. So, if you're older and you don't have income, or your property jacks up in value to, a million by whenever, 4% of a million, we're talking now 40 grand a year, even if you own the place. So this is just context that I want to put out there. This amount for me was basically around $1,800. But what's important over here is that I was also paying an HOA. And an HOA is not a loan or anything. It's a homeowners association, kind of like their cost. And so, I have a pool on the other side over here, which sounds great. But outside of, a few perks, every community is going to have, the HOA fee where if it's worth it or not. And so there's a lot of people that love an HOA because, everything looks organized, things are clean, shrubbery is, cut every so often, and, things look more organized and appropriate, which is great when you're trying to sell a property. In other words, like when someone sees the neighborhood, everything looks a bit more like clean, refined, as it should be, at least if an HOA is being used appropriately. But on the flip side, if you don't want anyone saying like, hey man, your door can't be that color, or hey, your Christmas decorations, why are they up now? Why are they up before Thanksgiving? What's going on? So like the point is they can kind of be like, yo, you can't do certain things which may seem really obvious or really simple to you. And so you're almost always under, the eyes of the HOA, as they say. So if you want more privacy, not anyone kind of getting in your business, you just don't need to pay an HOA. And so if your lawn, it's overgrown or you're out of town for 2 months, you don't have rules like, oh, you need to maintain your lawn or else you're going to get penalized. Here, you can just let it grow out, and when you come back, go take care of it. So that, again, is its own, whole discussion. And whether or not we want a HOA or not, for me personally, the HOA covers roof, which every 7 to 10 years, it's understood maybe around, it could be 10 to 20 grand. And as the years go on, other prices do increase. HOAs also go up. But because they cover this kind of bigger cost, the way I justify it is like, all right, they're kind of paying for something I would need to take care of. So that's like that perspective. So coming to the principal, interest, taxes, insurance is around like, let's say $1,800 plus HOA another couple $100, which for some that's like a lot of money to spend each and every month. But again, this helps with the roof. And then there's home insurance, which I've had a couple house claims, which that itself is truly another video. But man, so that could, it just depends. So because I've had claims, just like car insurance, if you get into accidents, you basically have a higher premium over time. And so for context, basically it was $750 per year, this home insurance to protect basically the home. So just say around $1,000 a year. So that math is around $80 change. So very simply put, low twos to keep it simple in terms of the total like overall cost without including like running costs such as like utilities and bills. In terms of how I actually got approved for the loan and otherwise, for me it was kind of like two-pronged, where one, just I got lucky being financially savvy. When I was 18, I got my first card. It wasn't related to spending. I was just like, hey, let me get a nice credit score, because I don't know what it's used for, but it's like a metric that could be useful later. That's like all I knew. I didn't understand macroeconomics. America runs on credit. Credit equals leverage equals you can do all these things. Like I knew nothing. So I just knew like, oh, this is part of the system. And so do the right thing. And, just that kind of thing to have whatever a credit score could mean at that time. Obviously it benefited me many, many years later. I was unaware about anything regarding credit cards, points, miles, like all that stuff. So really lucky over there. And the second part of this, I got very lucky because generally speaking, you need, let's say, 2 years of tax returns and 2, 3, or 6 months worth of pay stubs. It just depends on the kind of mortgage issuing process. But the point is, my mortgage broker, he was basically saying that, okay, hey, you're working in the same field as what you went to school with. So instead of 2 years of tax returns, you just need, let's say, one. to, kind of show proof that, okay, you're working, you're on the younger side, and whatever other criteria goes into issuing this type of loan. So I didn't even know this going into the process, but, obviously it benefited me because from there, without that little caveat, I would probably wait another year and, that could have been fine, but you just never know what you don't know. So after getting the loan, kind of just business as usual, we're in the thick of it, and eventually then COVID happens. So when COVID happens, things are kind of uncertain. Obviously, you have a house and it's kind of like, all right, hey, payments need to go on, keep your job stability or income stability and however you're trying to pay, your monthly payments. So fast forward and we're deeper into COVID now, and interest rates, they're not about to, kind of hockey stick back upwards, but it was basically at the bottom, and it was understood that, okay, hey, interest rates are low, like anything. And so to go from that 4.385%, I started hearing, okay, hey, there's rates like twos and threes out there. I was like, huh. So like, what does the math look like? And so simple maths, it looks like this. I'm going to keep the math simple. And so let's say that instead of 4.385 and this number, keep on repeating, I'm just going to bump it up to 4.5. And the reason is because I basically was able to refinance at 3% is basically what they were saying. And there's a concept known as buying points. Buying points essentially is, hey, you can pay cash upfront of a certain amount, and then let's say we can decrease your 3% to maybe a 2.9 or a 2.8 or a 2.7, etc. And so if this number is going to make sense for us, basically the math came down to be like, all right, all in, there's a cost to refinance, and including buying points, what it was for me was if I spend $6,000, then my interest rate can be basically 2.75%. Again, I'm going to keep the math simple. So here, what does this mean? It means, hey, how many periods is it going to take for me to basically recoup this refinance money? In other words, like, was it even worth it? So here, this difference over here of 4.5 and 2.75% is basically 1.75%. And again, I'm going to just keep this math simple because why not? So if we're getting 2% basically savings, just to keep it simple, on let's say now 250,000 loan. So basically I was making some payments just over time. So that was giving me some principal, but the way mortgages are basically set up, the amortization schedule they call it, it could be like, hey, 30 years doesn't mean you're paying half principal, half interest for 30 years. How the bank structured, and I understand the bigger why, basically they'll charge you more interest up front, and then you're basically getting less equity each and every period. And then in the longer term is where you're recouping true principal like on paper, where the beginning payments are more interest based. So anyways, 250K, 2%, how much is that? Basically 2% of 250K is roughly $5,000. And so now this $5,000, if you'd see that, like I spent 6K to save 5,000 each year, basically a little more than a year plus is when, it's like a break even. And with that break even, what that really means is, you're basically really saving around $500 a month for life. In other words, like 29 years almost of $500 less I need to pay just because I refinanced, like did nothing else. I just, it's like, hey, here's my contract, new lender, go pay off the old lender's balance. And on paper, this is what it is for the rest of the time of the loan. The caveat here is, we didn't plan on moving. We had this place over here. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to refinance and I'm looking to sell it and like all these things. It was basically like, why not? But one thing that I didn't know at the time, which I would love to tell us here, is I didn't even understand what a cash out refinance was versus a refinance. And so what it meant was I could basically take cash out of the equity in the home, and then you can do what have you with, whatever you want basically. So in like 2008, what people would do is you have a home, and then, you can, let's say the BRRRR strategy is what Jake was mentioning. So I think, again, it's like buy, rehab.
There's the strategy called the BRRRR method. That's the buy, rehabilitate, refinance, re-rent, repeat, something along those lines.
Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, and repeat. So you can basically buy a property that maybe has the capability to have some rehab done to it. So example, you buy a $200,000 property, it could be valued at 300K, you put 25K in, and then you're able to flip it for 300K. So 200 plus 25K of your cost is 225, you sell it for 3. Obviously, there's some other fees and admin costs in the middle, but that's basically like the simple flipping home kind of situation. But to take it a step further, instead of just flipping, of buying something, rehabbing, and selling it, basically if you buy, rehab, now you're renting it. Now, instead of like that mortgage, you needing to put more money, like your own money, hopefully a tenant can take over that payment and then some, so you have positive cash flow. So when you're renting, Now you can say, hey, bank, I have this income generating property. The property itself is already up. And so, in the same example, let's say we bought that 200K property, we put 25K in, and let's say it's worth 300K. So, as long as a bank or whoever's lending you that, refinance, cash out refinance money specifically, if they're like, oh, yeah, yeah, it's valued at 300K just through the appraisal process and what have you, then you can basically literally take, equity out of that property. And what do you do with that money? You can repeat it. So then you buy another property, rehab it, rent it out, refinance, and then repeat. So that's a concept. I didn't know like what I needed to know back then. And maybe it's a blessing because if you're only living like in your home, there's always a question, is it an asset? Is it a liability? And so the understanding is it's a liability for many because, it's not income generating in terms of like an asset. You're here, you're living, but it's not really making you money. Are you getting principal on paper? Like, is your net worth going up? Like it is. But that debate is its own thing. Like, is this an asset? Is it a liability? All that. With that understanding, basically, when I was going for a cash out refinance, the kicker was that, remember, in the beginning, I put 10% down on a 300K home. But when I refinanced, because of how much it went up on paper, they basically were like, hey, you're going to save, the PMI, the private mortgage insurance, which I also was paying because we're, having less than 20% equity in the property. Basically, on top of the interest savings period over period, it was basically this PMI cost that would disappear as well. So very powerful in terms of, what happened here. Because for me, what I didn't know was it was good for me to get into the deal because later, apart from just normal appreciation and otherwise, which is not always guaranteed, basically this was another benefit of me refinancing, even though it wasn't a cash out refinance and you can use that money to go make more money, you could also, not have that outcome, then you have more of a bigger loan. And depending on, your situation, if this is everything and where you live and if you have like kids, family and like all the things, then you really may not want to, screw up things where you are or over leverage yourself on in a situation such as like your home. The biggest thing I wish I knew before even all of this was the simple concept of rent hacking. This is where like, if we own the place and, I have two other, bedrooms and you're renting it out, it's kind of like living with roommates. But there's another situation which right after getting this, that's when all like, the light bulb kind of turned on in my head. I was like, oh man. And the point is, it was a $400,000 property, 4 units. So it's like a multifamily property. And even if you live in one of them, if you can command rent, which was going around $1,200 for each of them, basically, if you're living in one, you're not really paying yourself, but you're getting 12 times three, so like $3,600 worth of rent, and the mortgage there was high twos. So it's like a beautiful deal on paper. Of course, if like, tenants know you're the owner and they keep coming to you, or like there's fixes and stuff like that, I think at that time I wouldn't know what I needed to know, but then I would like have to learn fast and make it happen, whatever that, what have you. Point is, that type of situation would have been a totally different one because then you had like rental cash flow coming in. You also could just move out of there and let four of them just be taken up. Because later, what I got to know is it's not an investment property if you're living there and three other people are just happening to live there, but you got it as your primary residence. And it's generally understood like, hey, 2 years you live in a primary residence, you can just move on to somewhere else. And in that situation, that same property is like not an investment property and doesn't become one. It's just, oh, you moved on to somewhere else. Because typically when it comes to investment properties, you need 25% down. But in this situation, if you're living there, it's just like a primary residence. You can just live there as if, just buying this place in general where you don't need that X amount of down payment requirement. Jake's video was 8 minutes and change long. This video is probably way longer than that. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. Happy to answer. With that, thanks for coming to the end. Catch you next one. Peace.